Have you ever tried to define hope? Now, you can you can kind of describe it, and when it's absent most of the time. But boy, pinning it down to say this is the definition of hope, I struggle to do that. Now I know there's some things that will either enhance my hope or they will diminish it, right? But that doesn't define it. I can't even describe it very well. Hope is a sense that there is something better, at least other than, but really for it to be hope, it has to be better than what I'm experiencing now, sometime in the future. Why am I, trying to do this thing on hope? Because where we are in 1 Timothy 4 is in verse 10. And Paul is fleshing out, I think, a pretty complex, anyway. I don't know if complicated is the right word, but a little bit of a complex idea. He talks about a trustworthy statement. And the trustworthy statement is that godliness holds value for all things, holding promise for both this present life and the life to come. And then he goes on to say, this is a trustworthy saying that deserves full acceptance. That is why we labor and strive, because we have put our hope in the living God. Now, hope. Paul says we put our hope. I think a lot of us, me included, are waiting for hope to just wash over us, right? We're here. Come on, hope. Paul pretty much indicates that's not how it works. One aspect, I'm not going to say this is the whole thing on hope, but one aspect of hope is that we put our hope in the living God. All right, so in a similar way as with grace, grace assumes two things: the need of the recipient and the ability of the provider. Hope makes an assumption. There's an assumption behind hope. Let me just put it that way. And the assumption is that there is a provider of hope. So when I put my hope on anyone or in anything, anyone, then basically my hope is an outcome of the reliability and ability of the one in whom I put my hope. I think I made that pretty much as convoluted as is possible, though I didn't mean to. Well, okay, here's the deal. For me, this is one of the things, and I'll be honest with you and say, I have wrestled with hope for most of my 30s on in my life. I'm not a temperamentally hopeful person. I say that, and yet I have hope for the clients that I work with in my counseling practice. I really do have this sense that there is something better in their future than what they're experiencing now. I I often don't hold that same hope for myself. Does that make any sense? I don't know whether it does, but I've struggled with this concept of hope. I've struggled with it in terms of it being a reality for me in my own life. Paul says, the reason we labor and strive comes from this trustworthy saying that godliness holds value for all things, holding promise for both the present life and the life to come. Okay, so there is hope is connected to promise. And in a way, pardon me, that's what separates hope from wish. A hope is connected to, I don't know if I'd say founded on, but at least connected to a promise. And the promise for us as followers of Jesus is that godliness holds promise for both the present life and the life to come. I don't even know how to say this well. Resting on that promise is where our hope comes from. Our hope is not in the promise, it's in the promise maker. It's in it's in God. And Paul goes on to say, we have put our hope in the living God. Yeah, our hope is not in the concept that, life is cyclic, the circle of life. I mean, sorry, Elton, but yes, there is a circle of life, but that doesn't explain all of life. We don't put our hope in the fact that the pendulum swings politically, socially, culturally. I don't. I mean, I do believe that you can look at history and realize that pendulum does tend to swing, but that's not where my hope is. My hope is not in any one particular political party. Goodness, if the last couple of years hadn't demonstrated that there is no political party that you can put your hope in. I don't care what side of the aisle you support. It doesn't matter. Here's my point. Politics isn't going to save us. Now, we can get real messed up by inadequate or deceitful politics, but who's our Savior? Oh, well, Paul goes on to say, because we have put our hope in the living God, who is the Savior of all people. All right, the living God. Our hope, it rests in the living God, who has made a promise that godliness, which, by the way, we train ourselves to be godly, but godliness in itself holds promise both for this life and for the life to come. All right, that's a worthy promise, but it is only as good as the maker of the promise. And for us, here's the best news I know. The maker of our promise is the living God. Now, I don't think it's a very difficult stretch to understand why would Paul talk about the living God. Why don't you just say God with a capital G? Well, a couple of reasons. As I understand it, and I am not a scholar in this field, but in my study and in conversation with those who are scholars in the field of the original Greek of the New Testament, there aren't any capital letters or any lowercase letters. They're all one case. So it's not like in Paul's writing he could have capitalized the G and we'd know what he was talking about. So there's that. Here's another piece, a real big piece of this, in my opinion. Paul identifies our God as the living God. And one of the reasons is all the other gods are false, and the idols that in his day had been fashioned are dead. Isaiah says, this is one of the interesting, I don't know if that's not the right word, but I find it intriguing that he says of idol worshipers, with half the wood we carve an idol and we bow down to it. The other half of the wood we burn to make bread. It's like, do you not, where the disconnect is so obvious? Well, okay. What Paul is saying, I'm not talking about any of that. I'm talking about the living God. And then he even gets more specific. The Savior of all people. There is only one Savior. We know him. We know that it is Jesus, God the Son, who is our redeeming Savior. And that it's almost like Paul is kind of pushing a little bit of a Trinitarian view, or at least a Duitarian view of God the Father and God the Son here. He says, that is why we labor and strive. I'm not going to hit that too hard again, but just to say, you can't, if you're going to follow Jesus, there will be labor, there will be striving. That is why we labor and strive, because we have put our hope in the living God, who is the Savior of all people, and especially of those who believe. Now that phrase, and especially of those who believe, is a hiccup for me, or was when I first really took it seriously, instead of just reading through it and going, yeah, Savior, yeah, got it, move on. Maybe we ought to take a pretty close look at that. The living God is the Savior of all people, and especially of those who believe. Now, okay, I don't have it totally figured out, but here's a possibility, and I just present it for you to think about. You do realize that God acts as a Savior in non-eternal ways toward all people, right? There are times when he suspends the law of the laws of nature and laws of physics, which would have otherwise killed a person who made a mistake. There are times when people are, the consequences for their behaviors and choices seem to be suspended. That's not by chance, that's by God. God saves all people in one way or another from time to time from their own demise. But for those who have said yes to Jesus, all of a sudden the aspect of him saving us, especially to those who believe, is possible. Happens all the time, every day. For people who do not believe to be sometimes saved from negative consequences by the living God, who, because of who he is, he saves people. That's what he does. It's not the only thing he does, but it is what he does. especially those who believe. I think I have sufficiently demonstrated that I have not totally closed the loop on this in my own mind. But there's something there to maybe work with. And here's the biggest thing to work with. Put your hope in the living God, who is the Savior of all men, especially those who believe. And that's you, and that's me. I'll see you next time on Soul Care with Stevie Boy.